I don't know much about your job. I can certainly imagine something of what it might be like. In fact, if I were to tell any jokes at this point, it would probably be jokes you've heard 1,000 times before about librarians and technology. I know my experiences with trying to get information. How many people here have ever spent meaningful time searching for information in Stack Overflow? Okay, so it's a good crowd. So about 12 years ago, I started my first tech company, and I'm a computational scientist, but I'm not an engineer. So in prototyping out some of my first models, I spent a lot of time on Stack Exchange broadly across all these different things, trying to figure out, how to get a particular Django app up and running, and in fact, one of them we'll even see a slice of. And what I found were frustrating over and over and over again is all of my search queries returned someone else's answer. It was as though it almost intentionally misinterpreted what I mean. I mean, one thing's simple. I only program in Python, so if you're returning anything in Java, you're not actually helping me. And it seems so easy conceptually, right? If I'd actually talked to a real human being, they'd understand what I was after, they'd have given me pointers. I have the same problem, say, with Google Scholar. Probably out there in that long tail of Google Scholar searches, there is no average. And yet, when I do searches about life outcomes research, I frequently get completely useless stuff about areas of scientific research which are totally valid but have nothing to do with whether someone's conscientiousness is a predictor of how long they'll live. I get lots of stuff about cancer treatment. Not surprising, it's a big issue, but it's not the issue I'm searching on. So one thing I did way back when is I took some cognitive models I was testing in education, and I built something that I called cognitive overload, and it recast the searches in terms of my own personal cognitive model. So I had refiltered any returns based on the sorts of things that I was interested in. I probably should have actually built a little app and company around this, but we just used it internally. And it was a bit of a transformation. But one of the problems was that pretty soon it never took me anywhere new. It built a model of who I was right now, and not who I was trying to become. So I built this thing that I really intended to do good, and it did for a while. But it never grew out of the history it was building up for me. And I'm not my history, I would like to think. We are all not our history, we're our future. And for a computational scientist, that isn't just a kind of la-di-da statement. That is an actual limitation that people don't deal with, particularly in education. And we could go through the list of innovations that are meant to make our lives better. One of the most, in a sense, notorious recently has nothing to do with technology. It's the ban the box movement, which is one of the most well-motivated movements that I've ever come across. And it's this idea that on job applications, there's a box that says, have you been convicted of a felony? And it overwhelmingly hardens the job prospects of black men. Because so many of them, though certainly not all by far, but so many of them have a history that it becomes this totally outweighed thing. You can never escape from your history. So what a wonderful idea then to pass a law banning putting the box on applications. It may not feel like an innovation, but really that's the goal, is to innovate our way out of this. The problem is it didn't respect how people respond to information. So in Illinois, they finally passed a law banning the box. And what happened? If you model out what happened, essentially all black men now are treated as though they possibly had a past felony conviction. When you take information away from people, they don't fill in the way you want them to. They tend to fill in based on their biases. And most hirers' biases are not positive with respect to black men, whether they should be or not. In fact, it's been well demonstrated that the box is not actually predictive. Having a check in it doesn't predict anything about the quality of work that person does on the job. So incredibly well-intentioned, with a clear societal purpose, but it didn't actually understand the problems they And we see this again. Recently, a paper actually just early last week in Proceedings of the National Academy of Science looked at ephemeral social sharing sites, so things like Snapchat and others. The whole purpose of these sites is to protect your reputation, right? You're afraid of sending out a tweet which is going to be out there forever, and someone might actually call you on it, and you happen to be president, whatever. And so there was this great idea, which is actually well motivated, particularly for teenagers, where they would go through and start a Facebook account, send out a bunch of messages, and then literally delete the account at the end of the night and start all over again the next day. It prevented this information from being read by their parents, it prevented them from being read by other people in ways they didn't want it to. Sounds great. So what the research finds is yes, this ephemeral sharing systems actually encourage kids and adults to share much more broadly and much less reflectively than it did before. But turns out that's only half of the equation, because the other half is the people reading it. And it turns out they read those shares in exactly the same way as they read Twitter shares or regular Facebook shares or any other. So in fact, it turns out these ephemeral sharing networks actually harm reputation more than they protect it, which is exactly the opposite of what it's supposed to do. And again, it's another domain where if you really think about how people process information, how they take new information in and factor it into their beliefs about the world, it shouldn't surprise you. But we invent and we invent and we invent, and we have these aspirations that all of these inventions are going to make things better. And the brutal truth is they rarely do. Now, I'm going to spend some time going through some examples from my own work, and I'm hardly the only one, where I do actually think, I mean, the whole point of these examples is to say innovation is a good, artificial intelligence is a good, or at least it can be, but it's not trivial at arriving. As hard as innovation is, and it is brutally difficult, innovation that actually solves meaningful problems is as vanishingly frequent as innovation itself is to regular life. So let's start with one example here. This is, no one here is an actual person. Every one of these faces is instead a word in a language of faces. That language is being learned by what we now call a deep neural network. About 10 years ago when I put this together, there really wasn't a term that was in vogue, but that's essentially what this was. And we built this for my first tech company. We trained it by sending it out through Facebook and Flickr, which was still a thing at the time. And it just learned faces. But we needed it to do more than that. So we created a game. And what would you do if you had an amazing piece of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and an aspiration to do good in the world as a tech entrepreneur? You create an incredibly sleazy game called Sexy Face. So what happens in Sexy Face is you show up on the site and we show you an array of 18 faces and you pick the ones you think is sexy. And the AI tries to learn your pattern. And our promise is, once you've played the game for free, we'll find everyone on Facebook that you think is sexy. And for $5, we'll find everyone who thinks you're sexy. Okay, I'm not a terrible person. This is a Trojan, as it's called. So in getting people to play this game, once they did a pass through it, we never charged anyone anything. We didn't find sexy faces. But it really would learn it. I mean, I don't, whatever your kink is, as long as it's not about feet, it's got to be faces. Then it really worked. But then it would confess, oh, actually, it's just a generic mind reading game. Come up with any facial category. Southeast Asian, mutton chops, and a sense of ennui. As long as you were actually consistent, even in those real abstract categories, it would learn it. In fact, we ran a little experiment based on some previously published research. We had people essentially train the network on competence. And completely in keeping with the previous experimental research, we found that a competent face, even though people wouldn't and couldn't articulate exactly what it was they saw was competent, and we pretty easily summed up. white, male, old. What's interesting about those competency judgments, again, replicating findings in the experiment, is they were predictive of who was a CEO from those people who weren't. They were predictive of who was a CEO of a major public corporation versus a small private one. But it had no predictive validity for the actual business performance of those companies, which says something interesting about the multi-billion-dollar industry. So why did we actually build any of this? So it was part of a program called Refugees United for the United Nations. At the time we did this project, brought in by the company Ericsson, there were 1 million refugees, orphan refugees, in refugee camps around the world. And so I don't mean in the history of the UN. At that moment, there were 1 million orphans in refugee camps around the world. And I have no reason to believe that that number is any smaller today. So the problem was, people were going to these refugee camps looking for a sister or a brother or a parent, and not finding anyone. And then they think, well, what about my niece? And they would give them a book with 1 million photographs in it. And then I hope on day 3 you don't blink as your niece's picture goes by. So what we did in training this system up, and it's in the architecture of deep neural networks, there are higher levels of this, so words that are in that abstracted space that don't visualize well, capturing these more judgment, perceptual qualities about people's faces. So what we did was we took the game, we've populated it with all the kids from the book. About 3 minutes, you'd say, this kid looks a little bit more like my niece, and then a new screen, these 2 kids. And roughly in 3 to 5 minutes, if your niece is anywhere in a camp in the world, you found her. And I like to use this as an example, because outside of work I've done in my own family, which I might talk about in a moment, this is one of the things I'm most proud of. And I think it's a demonstration that you really can build artificial intelligence that does good in the world. I can't think of anything worse than having gone through all the strife, losing your family, and being abandoned in a war zone, than ending up in these camps. And so much effort is going in to try and provide services to these kids, and many of these camps go on existing for, in some cases, decades. Trying to provide some value back into that life is a huge, huge value to all of us. So I actually got my start doing this kind of facial machine learning at my undergraduate lab. So this was University of California at San Diego. I was undergrad there, and I have a very interesting history, which I'll reserve for now. But after a long term off, I returned. And a professor of mine recommended that I work in the lab. I had no background in machine learning. I thought I was going to be a wet neuroscientist at the time. They recommended me in the lab. And one of the heads of the lab is in the demo there smiling with the real-time facial expression. So what we were doing at the time was real-time lie detection for the CIA. So a little morally. And I always loved the things we were talking about, what we might actually be able to do with it someday. And it's interesting, a lot of what I learned there is what went into the project for the refugees. What you're seeing here, though, is something a little bit different. That lab spun off a startup. That startup struggled for a little while, kind of took a turn into the effective when deep neural network came out. And then they had this clever idea. They did a real-time expression recognition session on YouTube during one of the early Republican presidential debates, when there was like 57 of them on stage. I'm still curious what it actually did with Ted Cruz, but literally the next day the bidding war starts. And Apple and Facebook both wanted this. Apple won. So what you're seeing up in the corner is the new Animoji thing, all the new face recognition stuff, and the Apple 10 is my undergraduate lab, which is great in sort of self-congratulatory sense, like we did something that someone wanted to pay a grotesque amount of money for. and then turn into a ridiculous trivial app. Like, that's the heart of a lot of innovation, is you invent real-time lie detection for the CIA, and then you animate a cat face on your phone. So what did I do with this technology? Well, imagine what you could do if you built it in to a wearable device. So I'm walking around with Google Glass, and maybe I'm floating your credit scores over your heads, or pulling up your LinkedIn and Facebook accounts, or your Grindr accounts, actually Madison accounts, if that's you. I gave a talk to CFOs, and I got nothing out of Grindr when I said Ashley Madison. Clearly, that's where they spent their time. It is always interesting, though, when you throw out the Grindr. Many of you have no idea what I'm talking about, but you'll hear like 15% of the room bust up laughing, and you say, all right, now I know my people. So what did we do here? Well, obviously you can do a lot of nefarious things, right? Couldn't I conceivably build lie detection into my Google Glass and just wander around and read everyone's facial expressions in real time? Clearly that's people's responses. I mean, I wore Google Glass continuously for about 3 years for a very good reason. And the number of times people would say, "Asshole," under their breath as I walked past, clearly they thought I was doing something sort of sneaky and nefarious. But that wasn't it at all. We built a system that could do facial expression recognition. So you look at someone, and it would extract what's called the facial action code, from which work by this famous guy named Paul Ekman, and infer the emotion the person's expressing, write it on the screen, and we give it to autistic kids. Those that are what are called high-performing enough that they can actually interact with the system, they can actually interact with people. And it turns out, I mean, the state of the art right now are cartoon faces on flashcards. Even on computer equivalent is cartoon faces on flashcards. So we built this thing so that in actual, natural social interactions, people can learn to read facial expressions. And it turns out the brain processes social data, even in most autistics, fundamentally different than it processes non-social information. So wouldn't it make sense to learn how to read social cues? We want actual social information. So it turns out, not only, first order, it's just a prosthetic. So let's say you can't speak Chinese, as I can't. My option is to drag my kids around with me because they can. So they're a prosthetic for me. I have an order for the new Google headset, the new Google earpiece that does real-time translation. It could do translation for me. But what if you can't read facial expressions, which is one of the most common symptoms of autism spectrum disorder? That then becomes like a superpower. You built this into them, and it works. Not only can they learn, but it actually increases their empathy. Their theory of mind, their ability to understand the motivations of other people. It doesn't do anything to lessen the strengths, complex as they are, that come with autism. So this is an opportunity for at least some segment of those kids to grow up and not be treated as a burden, but be treated as people that are just different and productive in a different way. Productive is not the only way to think about humanity, but I'm often talking to CFOs. So this was a big thing to be able to do. And it was a lot of fun. I actually got to wear, I wonder what my next slide is. No. I actually got to wear Google Glass to the White House. The Secret Service was not happy about this at all. I swear I asked for permission, but clearly they didn't know what I was saying. So it was a swanky party, and the president and the vice president were there. President Obama. Somehow my invitations to the White House have dried up. And they wasted 5 minutes of his time deciding whether or not to kick out the crazy lady with the fluorescent blue computer on her face. And instead he wanted to meet me. And of course my first words to the President of the United States were, "Okay, class, take a picture." Which I've been told by Google is the only presidential portrait ever taken with Google Glass. It was a terrible picture, which speaks to why it was such a huge success as a product. And let me tell you, when you meet the president, try and put yourself in all of the the smiles and the thank you and the Mr. President, and then you meet this crazy woman whose first words are take a picture. Because his opinion of me did not go up. But I did let him know that the reason I was wearing them is because my son is a type 1 diabetic, and I built an artificial, I hacked all his insulin pump, his continuous glucose monitor, broke several federal laws, and built an AI that actually predicted into the future whether his blood glucose levels would go high or low. So I was getting real-time updates in Washington, D.C. when my son was with my sister back in San Francisco. And unsurprisingly, he got that. When it's your own kid, that one is right up there with the refugee stuff. But this is what it can do. Actually, Eli Lilly, I gave those algorithms away to a bunch of nonprofits as well as for-profits. I wanted people to go build it. Eli Lilly is building what's called an artificial pancreas now. It actually works better than the real thing using these predictive algorithms, which is interesting. It has its own ethical implications. If you have a family history of type 2 diabetes, you go in and get a prophylactic artificial pancreas. Do we let people compete in the Olympics if they have artificial internal organs that have nothing directly to do with their strength? But it's great to be in the midst of this. What's important in all this work, though, isn't that someone like me invents it and then decides to inflict it on the rest of you. None of these have worked that way. But rather that people like me invent this stuff, and then we decide how it gets used. And if having AI built into wearable cameras is something that we decide, you know, as nice as it is to use it for those autistic kids, the downsides are too big, I'm fine with that. But too often we get caught up in yes or no ethics for technology. It is a good thing or it is a bad thing. Facebook is entirely good or Facebook is entirely bad. I happen to think Facebook right now doesn't actually do us a huge amount of good. It's interesting to note that two of the original forces behind Facebook, one of the original funders and one of the original executives, have both written big pieces in recent weeks calling out Facebook and its methodologies. I happen to agree with everything they said, and I really wish they'd then donate their billions of dollars to a useful cause instead of just talking about it. Here's another one. I was asked to join the board of a small startup based in New York. They wanted to use real-time emotion tracking, and then had big ideas of what they could do with it. Broad ideas, but really it all comes down to selling ads. And I said, I am not going to join the board of your company and be your chief science advisor to help you sell ads. The world doesn't need that right now. You switch your business model just to market research and give me all of your data, and I'll join your board. Why did I want all their data? Because the night before, another person had pitched me their startup. I get lots of startup pitches nowadays. And it wasn't actually the pitch that mattered. As she was walking out of dinner, she turned back to me and said, by the way, I would drop it all if you could figure out how to treat bipolar. I don't know what her personal history was. Was it an academic interest, personal experience, family? That's all I know is she had planted that idea in my head. Now I'm a neuroscientist, but I don't really, I mean, the truth is autism and bipolar and various things that might be described as disorders, but I prefer the term non-neurotypical. It just wasn't areas of my research. I'm a theoretical neuroscientist. We just make shit up on computers. I don't deal with real problems. But she planted this idea in my head, and I'd spent all night reading papers about bipolar disorder and about research and whether it was actually able to predict manic and depressive episodes before they happen. By the way, if you're not familiar with bipolar, if you've ever seen the show, for example, Homeland, I think it was, the main character suffered. So this is this disorder that involves these sort of elated, creative, manic highs, and then crashing depressions. 25% of severe sufferers will go on to kill themselves. Turns out it is the costliest mental health disorder in the world. And I knew none of this before. I mean, I knew the basics, at least pretend to be a neuroscientist, but I knew none of those details. So the next day, I made a startup that has all of this real-time emotion data. And I thought, I'll join your board if you let me build a system to predict manic episodes. And I'm going to skip a lot of the technical detail. What you're seeing here is a heat map. It turns out motion, as was informed by a lot of the research I read, motion is a big predictor. Motion in your elliptic movements, motion through your home, motion through regions of space, gyroscope, accelerometer, all of these signals that we could get off the phone. We saw these incredible, rich insights, not static insights. It was all about change. So when did we see a pattern build up, and then when did we see that change? And it turns out when we saw those changes, within days we had high probability of upcoming manic episodes, as much as 3 to 4 weeks in the future. So if you're not familiar again with bipolar, the drug treatments, for example, lithium, only work in half the sufferers. Amazingly, the first paper that ever showed molecularly why that's true just came out. We just have been stuffing lithium into people because it worked, and you crossed your fingers. But it's famously a terrible experience. It sort of destroys your sense of self, your creativity, so people go off of it, and then they have an episode, and then they lose their job, they get divorced, they get institutionalized, and many of them will go on to kill themselves. So one of our tricks was have a trusted confidant receive a message. So if your sister, your doctor, a parent, a loved one, whomever, high probability of an episode in the next 3 weeks. And what can you do with that? No one knows because no one's ever been here before. Unfortunately, the time it takes to go on and off drugs is too long to work on a multi-week time scale. Feels like we got a lot of leeway there. But what was actually exciting, and I found as my general methodology for all the things I've talked about so far, was that there was no fancy. I would not call the system we built AI, except in the broadest possible terms. A little bit of machine learning to identify what was going on in the signal streams. But almost all of the innovation came from reading the literature. And this is a problem that is recurrent in technology. People like me think we're inventing things for the very first time. And by inventing, like we are exploring what are the right signals to look for in hiring someone for a job. We're trying to predict manic episodes as though no one's ever done it before. In my experience, and I've now founded a lot of companies and done a lot of different work. It's all related to people, but it's very broad. In my experience, every problem has been researched for 100 years. Everything. And it is insane to pretend otherwise. So what we do, particularly in modern artificial intelligence, is we train up this very small army of elite, largely, but not exclusively men, to take this sort of arcane art, metaparameter tuning, neural networks, and we say, go solve this problem, like, you know, they're Harry Potter with a wand. And I'm not saying these people aren't smart. I'm not saying these technologies aren't amazing. But artificial intelligence, like any technology, is just a tool. It is neither the problem nor the solution. And if you think it will magically solve your problems, what I virtually guarantee you is it will make things worse. And so you have these people, and they go in there and they think, this is an actual paper that was published. It came to my attention specifically because of how ridiculous it was. But it said, who should you hire for a good, reliable employee? And they applied an AI, just deep learning to it. You should look for people that grew up in conservative communities, largely exclusively white, from wealthy backgrounds. I don't disagree that that likely is sort of a true statement about the world, that people like that go on to have better careers. But I don't think you're actually describing a causal model here. I mean, one thing I can say, I built a company called Guild. We built a database of 122 million people, as we said, to try and take bias out of the hiring process. And 3 things that recruiters are highly sensitive to, they would never admit to. Race, gender, and age, we found were not predictive of anything. Well, they were genuinely predictive of career outcomes, but they weren't predictive of the quality of work people did. Age, actually, typically in software developers, older developers were better, which is not a noise that Silicon Valley wants to hear. So it was interesting to really go in, not from AI is going to solve my problem, but when I became the chief scientist of that company Guild, in my whole life, I've never had to what the hell do I know about what it takes to get a job? So I spent 3 months reading everything I could get my hands on. Economics literature, business school literature, industrial psychology, what predicts rate employment. And then we simply built machine learning systems to look for those qualities. We threw in everything else as well because we wanted to cover our asses and test our bases, including all those HR no-nos you're supposed to do, just turned out to be great. And so it was kind of shocking. 5 years since we originally published that work, that people are still so misled. I agree that what they found is a statistical reality. The people from privileged backgrounds will have privileged futures. Deep insight there. But if you'll indulge me in a little metaphor for a moment, particularly related to deep networks, it is massive systems, millions, maybe in some cases hundreds of millions of parameters. And what they describe is a massive, endless desert, just an absolute wasteland. And what you believe, and usually turns out to be true, is that within this wasteland, can't be seen from a distance, there are these oases. And that dark art of making them work that these people have learned at Stanford and MIT and other places is how to, really it's how to get close to the oases so you can actually smell the water and head towards them. And the failure is thinking that if I found an oasis, I'm done. Because I found a statistical relationship. When in fact, again, in my experience, most of them are mirages. The number of actual, meaningful solutions is as small to all of those statistical mirages as the mirages were to the original desert. And that may sound really pessimistic, but it's not. If we starting from the neural network to solve our problems for us perspective, we actually go and do some real research, and we figure it out what it is. Now, once you get into it, once you launch a neural network and you start training and you interact with the data, you learn all sorts of new things too, and that's great. But you have to start with some actual knowledge about people, which is in shockingly short supply. I wonder what's next. Oh, so there we go. I get asked a great deal to speak about the future of work, particularly in the context of technology, automation, and artificial intelligence. And so here's my very provocative statement. Human capital is a toxic asset. I have a book that's coming up titled How to Robot-Proof Your Kids, another one called The Tax on Being Different, which is about what happens when you use machine learning and AI to look at questions of bias and inclusion, which apparently nobody does. But in this case, we're looking at what it actually means to be human in a very automated world. And there's a lot of great books out there that I can highly recommend. The Second Machine Age, The Rise of the Robots, the great books that are really say they really set up the technology story well. But they don't tell a story about people. And I think that's crucial in understanding why innovation so frequently misfires, is we don't sufficiently understand people when we develop these new technologies. So I wrote, actually I was asked to write an op-ed about it, and I didn't really like the op-ed, so I rewrote it as a short story and sent it in unsolicited, and they published it, which was very nice of them. And it was about a young man, not a long-haul trucker, not a farm worker, not a factory worker where a lot of this talk about automation is going on, a financial advisor. Oh, an analyst in this case, working at some big nondescript Wall Street bank, on his last day of work because he's trained out the deep reinforcement learning system to replace him without realizing. And I think it's worth understanding that the effects of automation aren't restricted to any particular group. In fact, I think people broadly speaking in professional services, which might well include a lot of library and information science workers, certainly includes doctors, lawyers, financial advisors, and analysts. they will be some of the hardest hit because they're still in this space of a promise. We promise you that if you go to college, you study hard, you get good grades, and you get a job, you're going to have a good life. And that promise is starting to unravel, not just for coal miners, and not just, Uber asked me if I'd be their chief scientist, which took me like 3 seconds to say, hell no. But a big part of that no was, I'm not interested in building self-driving cars. They're very cool. I'm more than geeky enough to find them cool, but I'm interested in making better people, and that kind of feels like the exact opposite. But it's, when we get deep into these problems, though, we see it's not restricted to any particular population. But also, not that this story is an end state. When I say human capital is a toxic asset, what I mean isn't that people are terrible and useless. I actually fundamentally believe that everybody can be amazing. And if you don't believe that, you shouldn't be a teacher. Everybody can change. Everybody can grow. But I also believe that most of us aren't built, if you will forgive that, for this world, which is totally honest. Most of us are up under this basic promise. You go to high school, get a job in the coal mine, and we'll take care of you for the rest of your life. There was a great series of interviews done by NPR following the election with a bunch of West Virginia coal miners, and one after another said, well, actually, I'm a British Democrat, and I don't really believe that Donald Trump can give me my job back, but for 10 years, people have been promising to retrain me for a new job. And at least he said he'd try to just get me back in the coal mine. And that's all I want now. They're completely spent on the idea that a 6-week job retraining program is going to somehow make them employable in this future world. And they're right. They're 100% right. You can't change a person in 6 weeks. And what we need is to change people. It's not about skill sets. I'm going to get into this a little bit. Partially because hopefully many of you are in academia and have some sense about what it means to be a resource for people to grow in their space. And I'm going to call someone out as a perfect example of innovation that did not accomplish what it promised, which is Coursera. My wife and I gave a keynote at South by Southwest EDU a few years ago, where when Coursera was at its height, and I said, I know Andrew pretty well. A couple papers together in the computational neuroscience world. Daphne Koller I met a few times. But as we said, it takes a couple of Stanford AI professors to think that just making information available is the actual solution to making the world a better place. And they deserve the criticism because their whole tagline is we're democratizing education. And then you look at who actually goes to Coursera, and it's a pretty 18th century definition of democracy. Everyone, the vast majority, have already gone to college and are already socially and economically empowered. It's not information availability that's the challenge. If it were, every one of your libraries would have a line to get in. It's engagement. It's making people believe that their hard work is going to pay off. The unfortunate reality is going to the library is hard work, particularly if you have no family history of that kind of effort making a difference in the course of your life. And that's not just true about America. I do work in South Africa, East Africa, India. Most of these families, regardless of the political changes in South Africa, have a very long history that the color of their skin means a hell of a lot more than how hard they work in terms of how their efforts are going to pay off. And changing that belief, much less changing the realities of the world, is an incredible challenge. So I gave a TED Talk, so I won't delay too much into this other than recommending it. It was called The Fanatic, except they retitled it. I guess Fanatic is too scary. The title for a TED Talk. They retitled it the very poetic Paradox of Incentive Insensitivity. So go check it out sometime, but the punchline of it is the following. In analyzing massive data sets, again, starting with 122 million people, what we found again and again was that the highest performing people were the ones that were the least sensitive to incentives. Incentives being bonuses, grades, test scores, praise of their parents, the scorn of their peers. All of those are what we call exogenous motivation, incentives. And it turns out the more people pay attention over the long term, the less occur in sometimes profound ways. Great study, 10,000 West Point cadets. They looked not at the predicted graduation rate, but terminal rank attainment 10 years later. Grades didn't predict anything. Predicted perfect predictor of graduation rate by definition. Didn't predict anything about terminal rank attainment. Endogenous motivation predicted rank, awards, accommodations, whether they actually stuck it out for 10 years. And then the really interesting finding, exogenous motivation was a negative predictor of growth. Now think about what that means in the context of formal school systems, in the context of workspaces, where almost everything is about exogenous motivation. Whether you intend it to be or not, tests are exogenously motivating. High-stakes assessments. One of my favorite pieces of research, sorry, I'm rambling here, so at any point just say, shut the hell up, let's do the questions now. There's a guy named Raj Chetty, who I suspect at some point will win a Nobel Prize, but he's at Stanford right now, an economist. And he did this thing where he did value-added modeling in teachers. Now this is a very controversial thing to do, but he did it very well. And what he looked at, though, wasn't test scores. He looked at value-added modeling in terms of how individual teachers increased the lifetime earnings of their students. My research looks more broadly than just earnings, but I'll come back to that in a moment. What he found was two things. One, there were teachers that had these really outside programs, which maybe is not surprising. But what was really fascinating was that in the years immediately subsequent to being in those teachers' classrooms, the students actually performed slightly worse on their grades and standardized tests. Meaning that the assessments themselves were assessing the wrong things in the first place, and they were creating, not just for the kids, but for the teachers, a perverse assessment and incentive to do, in a sense, the wrong thing. And so it's shocking. And why do these people do it anyways? Because they're fanatics. Because those teachers didn't care, and they were imparting part of their fanaticism onto the kids. But endogenous motivation is just one of many constructs. So in my work now, we track about 45 distinct constructs, both in kids and in people in the workplace. To sort of summarize them, we roughly put them into 5 categories. So general cognitive ability, things like working memory span, literacy, numeracy, metacognition, self-assessment, planning, creativity, social skills, emotional intelligence. So none of these are my specially unique constructs. The reason they're on this list is that there is substantial body of literature on the specific construct saying 2 things. One, it is highly predictive, almost certainly causally related to life outcomes. And I define life outcomes broadly. So from a recent paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science looking at 5 of these constructs, we define life outcomes as wealth accumulation, income, walking speed at age 65, social connectedness, subjective measures of happiness, objective measures of happiness, and 7 different measures, biomarkers of health outcomes, including some congenital ones. So what's interesting is these constructs are 1, predictive, almost certainly causally. For example, working memory span we know is causally related to positive life outcomes. And they're changeable. That's what's really important to me. I can't change the zip code someone grew up in. That's sort of a social justice issue that we all need to tackle. But in an individual person, you can change every one of these qualities. It might be harder when you're older. And some of them, particularly the general cognitive abilities, you can't really positively affect past ages 5 to 8. But even those, as maintenance came later in life. Here's another innovation. And I rarely make predictions. I'm not a futurist. But here's one that I'm more than willing to make. In about 40 years, there will be a substantial uptick in early onset dementia. Why? One of the things we know is prophylactic against early dementia is navigating through space on a regular basis. A lot of this research was originally done with London cabbies, replicated again and again. As a general statement, I get asked this a lot, should I do brain training games? No, because they're completely useless. You want to stay cognitively healthy through your life, learn new languages, learn to play musical instruments. No one's done this research, but given it for the first two, probably learn to program if you know how to do it. Do a real-world, complex, effortful thing that extends over time. Live your life, in a sense, and continue to grow. These are the things that we know, along with exercise, and one of the others, take a different route to work every day. So you're actually thinking about it. You're not automatizing the process. Well, that's saying we don't just automatize it. I mean, I do it. To get here, I opened Google Maps, and it told me how to get here. And I travel all over the world nowadays, so it's genuinely valuable. But, you know, we're not digging deep in the consequences. I saw there was a session earlier today about VR. I think VR there's some amazing findings about what it means to embody people in different bodies and experiences. So taking people, making them in smaller bodies relative to the world around them, they exhibit all of these interesting behavioral changes that are really interesting, and think about the retraining. But I complement that with some research out of a lab in UCLA that raised rats in VR. It's a little bit different than, you know, a regular rig, but their hippocampus, their core of our memory centers, develop abnormally. It might be worth understanding this before every kid spends as much time in VR as they currently spend gaming. That could be a real tragedy, and, you know, talked about like lead consumption on the same levels as that. And I'm not saying this, I don't know, but again, there's a mad dash to get new technologies out there and hope to capture a whole new marketplace and a whole new medium of, let's be blunt, sales channel, when we need to really understand some of these a bit better. So this is the nature of my research, and my research, which I have tricked a lot of venture capitalists into thinking I'm an entrepreneur, but my research is how do we take what we know about this to actually change the long-term outcomes of kids. So I already told you, grade, well I didn't, but so you know, the other things we looked at in that massive 122 million person database to try and predict who's the right person to hire, what's not predictive, grades, standardized test scores. Not once I know other things about you. Of course, if you are a summa cum laude at Harvard, and that's the only thing I know about you, it tells a pretty powerful story. But bluntly, that's why you got there. It's a latent variable story. And what we found is, yes, elite universities do add a tiny bit. A Bachelor of Computer Science from Stanford is a positive predictor of your ability as a software developer. A pretty modest one, totally swamped out by things like motivation. And I'm a deep believer in higher education. I'm not one of those Silicon Valley types that's like, throw it all out. I know all of them seem to have graduated from Stanford Business School, but reserve that comment. I can go on and on this topic, and I don't want to. This is some work I'm doing. We're building, for lack of a better descriptor, an AI. It's really a very complex, multifaceted system that's tracking individual information flow inside of a giant company. It's about 150,000 people work at this company. You're only seeing a tiny subset there in this social graph. And what we're actually tracking is where do they die? How do they transmit through local social groups and then broadcast out new innovations to the broader group? Which of those ideas are actually predictive of success within the company and which aren't? And it's fascinating to look at this. And part of what we look at is that a single individual dot, what is that person actually contributing to the organization as a whole? Incredibly difficult question to answer. But it turns out we have a lot of math from deep neural networks to kind of answer that very question. And it turns out the people that add the most value are often the most under. Because what we're capturing not just is, are they doing the jobs that are getting recorded for their next annual assessment, but what did they say to their friends at the water cooler? I mean, we're really intrusive. This is mad science here. It's not meant, this is not HR approved. And we see, you said something. Every time you hang out with this friend at the water cooler, their team is more productive afterwards. You guys get together. I'd love to do this cross-organization and see how these sorts of events actually go back and increase productivity. And I started thinking about this in academia, where over and over again, we would not give tenure to junior faculty, or never even give interviews to postdocs, that everyone knew made the whole department go. But they didn't publish great, and they didn't bring in a lot of money. And so even though we knew letting them go would make the whole system worse, we did it because their individual numbers were not the right numbers. And here we have a chance at a 500,000 people to try and do it differently. It was very forward thinking. I actually got the chief scientist for people at Amazon, and I ended up saying no to them. But what I gave them a counteroffer. I said, if I can make 1 million people's lives, that was their pitch to me. In 7 years, we'll be a 1 million person company. Your job will be to make it better. If you know me, that's a great pitch. And it's the first time I've ever gone and met with senior leadership at a big company about a potential job. I still said no, but I gave them a counteroffer. If I can make 1 million people's lives better, I'll do it for free. I don't particularly want to do whatever Jeff tells me to, because I'm pretty certain that's not going to be the job description you just gave me. But they, I mean, the ethos there is very, they all think Kool-Aid rather deeply. But, you know, call me a fellow, give me all your data, and for free, I'll run my math science, and you can reap whatever benefits or whatever stuff. They said no, and I was kind of surprised about that. So I've had a whole long series now of companies and government institutions come to me and say, is 500,000 people enough to interest you? And my answer is always yes. So we just founded a think tank to basically scale this out and take it even bigger and do crazy mad science inside schools, inside companies, and make a difference. We just brought in the Lego Foundation as a partner. I love this sort of stuff. But I also recognize it shouldn't be for me to decide whether this translates from mad science to what HR should be from now on. However smart I think I am, and I almost certainly think I'm more smart than I am, which is not true throughout my whole life, I shouldn't do this alone. Neither should Jeff, or Mark, or Jack Ma at Alibaba, or any of these people. Run as fast as they can, produce as much of a technological impact as they can, and then let all the rest of us catch up. And I'm not saying that the solution here is to slow down technology and AI development. I don't know if we could, even if we wanted to. But we do need to develop social institutions that are more involved in these decisions, that can move faster to these changes, and give a pluralistic voice to how innovations will be released into the world, rather than us constantly cleaning up mess after another, simply because some junior ranger genius thought that they had figured out all of humanity based on a computer science project at Stanford, which seems to be what's driving so much of what we do today. So I could go on and on. I think I probably maybe even used up all of my question time, but I'm happy to hang out for a little bit and answer questions. There's so much more I want to say, and I can't. So I'll leave it at this. It was a quote. I was supposed to speak at the Grace Hopper conference, and unfortunately I couldn't make it this year. And very flatteringly, they wrote a quote of mine up on the wall. And so I've just been using it everywhere because I didn't even remember saying it until someone tweeted it back at me. And it was, ambitious men are promising us spaceships and artificial intelligence and cybernetics. If every little girl had been given the reins to her own potential, we'd already have them. And if we wouldn't, it was probably because she made a pretty good decision. So thank you very much.